What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burnett. I want to start out this video by first of all saying thank you all, everybody who's tuned in and watched my video from North Dakota State at South Dakota State. That was an incredible environment, incredible experience. Not the most incredible game, but overall such a blast to go to that game and be able to see all you guys in the comments who are obviously either North Dakota State fans or South Dakota State fans. So thank you for tuning in. Hoping to get maybe more content like that. I'm certainly going to be trying to devote a little bit more time to talk about the FCS on this channel if my regular work, being a sports editor at the Council Bluffs Nonpareil, allows for it. But before I get into things in this video, if you go on to enjoy this video and want to see more like it, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I upload. Final part of my Week 9 breakdown of college football action, I'm going to be talking about the Big 12, ACC, and Group of 5 picture, kind of bringing those all together. Starting out with the Big 12, BYU overcame a 2-score first half deficit and outscored Iowa State 24-3 in the second half to come away with a 41-27 win. Falea Tau Satuela, hopefully I'm saying that right, got a big pick six in this one for the Cougars. Bear Bachmeier with another big game. As long as BYU continues to win, Bachmeier, along with his brother Tiger Bachmeier, and I think Bear is probably in the Heisman discussion. He had over 350 total yards, 300 passing, and almost 50 rushing, and 3 total touchdowns. And for Iowa State, their last gasp college football playoff hopes are over. That's 3 straight losses. Been a rough stretch for Matt Campbell and the Cyclones in Ames, but they will have chances to kind of get back and at least maybe finish with 8 or 9 wins this season, which would be a positive for them. I'll talk more about BYU when I go over kind of the conference hierarchy later on in this video. Texas Tech regained their footing. There's not a whole lot to talk about here. It was a 42-0 stomping of Oklahoma State, and I just feel for the Cowboys. They are probably one of the worst teams in Power 4 college football, which to me kind of stings to see because their quarterback, Zane Flores, who had been dealing with injuries, I think was back this week, was a player who I covered in high school. So obviously when you have a player like that, and I know what a great guy he is, I want to see Oklahoma State get back, and hopefully they will. He's still a young quarterback. That team is going to either hire somebody from within or find somebody out there, and hopefully things will get corrected in Stillwater. Cincinnati wins big at home over Baylor, 41-20. Brendan Sorsby had a really efficient game. Watching it seemed like he had bigger stats than this, but 196 total yards, 3 touchdowns, and then the 2 running backs, two guys who transferred in from bigger Power 4 schools. Tawi Walker, who played at Oklahoma and Wisconsin, and Evan Pryor, who kind of had a cup of coffee at Ohio State. Those 2 guys combined for 150 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And the UC defense also forced 2 fumbles and recovered both in this game. So I'll talk more about the Bearcats' outlook here in a little bit as well. Finally, Houston stuns Arizona State in Tempe 24-16. Connor Weigman, the Texas A&M transfer quarterback, had 2 rushing touchdowns. The defense did allow Sam Levitt to throw for 270 yards, even without Jordan Tyson, but they got the stops when they needed to. And Eddie Walls III had a huge game with 3 sacks for the Cougars in this one. So looking over the Big 12 hierarchy, to me, it's BYU. They're number 1. They're 8-0, 5-0 in conference. They're going to have games at Texas Tech, home against TCU, at Cincinnati, and then home against UCF, against Central Florida. Those games, the first 3 I mentioned, it's a 7-1 Red Raiders team, 6-2 Horned Frogs, 7-1 Cincinnati, 2 of those on the road. That's a tough slate. They've proven themselves up to this point, but those are probably going to be, to me, the toughest games they've played so far. They had Utah at home and then Iowa State on the road, but I think Texas Tech will be their toughest opponent yet. And the way Cincinnati's playing, that might be their toughest opponent yet too. And TCU is not a team to overlook either. Josh Hoover's a really good quarterback there. Then the Bearcats, 7-1, 5-0 in conference. They've got a big one this week, kind of a sorting type of game at Utah. Then they're home against Arizona, that game against BYU, and at TCU. Horned Frogs are getting everybody. Texas Tech then 7-1, 4-1 in conference. They're at Kansas State, who, shout out the Wildcats. They've kind of rebounded from a rough start this season. They're sitting 4-4. They had a huge dominant rivalry win over Kansas, which I think makes it 17 straight in the Sunflower Showdown. Big win for the Wildcats there. Then Texas Tech also has BYU, and then home games against Central Florida and a road game at West Virginia to finish the season. Houston then is 7-1, also 4-1. They're home against West Virginia, at UCF, home against TCU, and at Baylor. I would say the Cougars, probably out of those teams that I've talked about so far, have the easiest schedule. That game against TCU is important. And speaking of the Horned Frogs, they're kind of right there. Them and Utah, I think, are kind of interchangeable. They're both 6-2 and 3-2 in conference. The Horned Frogs, again, home against Iowa State, at BYU, at Houston, and home against Cincinnati. Boy, that is a gauntlet of a final 3 games in conference. But if they can find a way to win all 3 of those and get help elsewhere, I mean, that would be, if those are the only losses for BYU and Cincinnati, then they wouldn't. But if somebody else beats either BYU or Cincinnati, TCU could still find a way to sneak into the Big 12 championship game. Utah as well, kind of similarly. They're home against Cincinnati, but then their schedule actually really opens up. They're at Baylor, home against Kansas State, and at Kansas. If they can get past Cincinnati, then they're looking at, they're probably hoping for, probably Cincinnati to lose to BYU, and then you could be set up for potentially a holy war in the Big 12 championship game. So that's kind of the outlook there. I might break that down a little bit more when I do my Week 10 preview. So stay tuned for more there. Finally, the final Power 4 conference, the ACC. Georgia Tech crushes the Orange, pun intended, Orange Crush, 41-16. Haynes King with 5 total touchdowns. And then they won the second and third quarters. You talk about the middle 8. In this case, I'm talking about the middle 30. 31-7 for Georgia Tech. It was 3-3 after the first quarter. They ran away with it. Syracuse got a kind of, give me 6 points late, and Georgia Tech also got 7. But dominant win for Yellow Jackets, who still look like the top team in the ACC by kind of a widening margin. Miami routs Stanford. Virginia survives by literal inches on a 2-point conversion attempt in overtime, getting the win in Chapel Hill over North Carolina. Louisville beats Boston College, and then kind of throwing a wrench into the ACC picture in terms of teams that had been undefeated in conference play. Wake Forest upsets SMU 13-12. Looking over the hierarchy here, Georgia Tech to me is the top team. Like I said, they're 8-0, 5-0 in conference. They're at NC State, at Boston College, home against Pitt. Look out for the Panthers. We'll talk about them more a little bit here in a second. And then obviously that huge non-conference game against Georgia. I think Georgia Tech's probably going in that game against Georgia at 11-0, and I think Georgia is probably 10-1 going into that game. So that is a huge game. It might not be a huge game in terms of significance of making the college football playoff unless one or both of these teams loses a game somewhere that I don't expect them to. But it will be a really good game, one of the best games that we've seen in the clean, old-fashioned hate rivalry in a long time, I guess before last year. But especially in terms of the magnitude around it. Georgia Tech was good last year, but they weren't in the contention for anything. This year, they're a legitimate college football playoff contender and probably the favorite out of the ACC. Anyways, Virginia, with that survival, another week of surviving, they're 7-1, 4-0. They're at Cal, home against Wake Forest, so watch out for the Demon Deacons there. They're the agents of chaos right now. At Duke and home against Virginia Tech. To me, that schedule also sets up for the Cavaliers, though. I mean, Cal and Duke are trap games. Wake Forest has shown they can beat a team on the road, but I think the Cavaliers will be favored in all those. Chandler Morris continues to play really well at quarterback. He did struggle a little bit against North Carolina, but he did what he needed to do to help him to the win. Then Louisville is there. They're 6-1, 3-1. They obviously hold that win over Miami. They're at Virginia Tech, home against Cal, home against Clemson, and at SMU. That game against SMU could, if Virginia were to lose somewhere, that could determine who gets to the ACC championship game because SMU also has one loss in conference. Then you've got Miami, who's at SMU. That one's also big. That'll be kind of a sorting game, now that I think about it. If whichever team wins, Miami or SMU, the loser is probably out of the picture. Even Miami with 2 losses, I think that would drop them further. That loss to Louisville hurts them as well. But then the Hurricanes are also home against Syracuse, home against NC State, at Virginia Tech, and at Pitt. Final week of the regular season this season is starting to really shape up across college football as a really interesting game, an interesting week, especially for games between teams that have 1 or 2 losses that are trying to find a way to get into the playoff. In the Big Ten, I talked about Oregon against Washington, Ohio State against Michigan, Texas A&M against Texas, potentially Vanderbilt against Tennessee. There's a lot of games, and this will be one of those too, potentially Miami against Pitt, because Pitt to get there. Now, for Pitt, it might not be as much to get into the college football playoff, but it could be to get into the ACC championship game, because they're at Stanford. They host Notre Dame. The way the Fighting Irish have been playing, they had a bye this past week. I think the Panthers probably lose that one, and then they're at Georgia Tech and home against Miami. But those are tough games, but Pitt has everything in their hands because they only have one conference loss. So as long as they avoid what happened to Florida State when they go out to Palo Alto to face the Cardinal and avoid an upset there, doesn't really matter what happens against Notre Dame because I think they'd have to get in automatically. Those games at Georgia Tech and home against Miami, this Pitt team, Pat Narduzzi, it seems like one year they're not so good, but then they'll have a year where they're really good. I think of the season, they had 10 wins and made the ACC championship game. And I'm trying to remember now if it was last year or 2 years ago, but I think it was last year. They started like 6-0 or 7-0 and then finished with like 6 straight losses. So they showed signs of it recently, and they're kind of playing up to that again this year. And then finally Duke as well has 1 loss. So look out for Pitt because they play those important games. A win over Georgia Tech and Miami would, I think, put them into the conference championship game because they'd have the head-to-head over both of those teams. So that's kind of the outlook for the ACC. Finally, the Group of 5 outlook, really kind of focusing on the American Conference because that's where I think the college football playoff bid is going to come from, but it is chaos in the American. Memphis stirred up more of that chaos this past week with a stunning 34-31 win over South Florida. They were down 31-17 going into the 4th, and honestly, I had jotted down while I was watching these games that South Florida, to me, in that moment, looked like 2021 Cincinnati, the team that went in and beat Notre Dame on the road. And to me, how South Florida played against Miami might not be equal to that, but it's fairly comparable how they had played really well in conference. But Memphis decided to throw a wrench into all of that. Brendan Lewis had a really good game, 307 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. Defense played really well against the pass, 9 pass deflections in this game. So really, really disruptive in the passing game for Byron Brown, who had played really well up until kind of later in the game as the Bulls were held scoreless. So it's a jumbled mess, and there's a lot of big games to go over in the American. Honestly, this could be its own video. Right now, leading the way is Navy. They're 7-0, 5-0 in conference. They're at North Texas, at Notre Dame, home against South Florida, at Memphis, and home against Army. Each of those teams that I mentioned, they're all in contention. Every game that Navy plays the rest of this season is huge. And even that game against Notre Dame, I wouldn't expect them to win, but boy, if they could pull the upset there, they will be in great territory, and that would knock the Irish out of the playoff contention. Tulane is next, also undefeated in conference at 3-0, 6-1 overall, at UTSA, at Memphis, home against Florida Atlantic, at Temple, who's also kind of in this picture still a little bit, and home against Charlotte. For Memphis, the team that just got that big win over South Florida, they're 7-1, 3-1, holding that tiebreaker in the standings over the Bulls. They're at Rice, home against Tulane, at East Carolina, and home against Navy. So their final 3 games are all against teams that are in this picture. Then you've got South Florida, who's 6-2 overall, 3-1 in conference, home against UTSA, then at Navy, at UAB, and home against Rice. So out of these teams, South Florida has probably the easiest schedule, but right now they already have a loss. There are 2 teams ahead of them that don't have a single loss in conference, including Navy, who's already played 5 conference games. And then they also have that head-to-head tiebreaker against them in comparison to Memphis. Finally, 3 other teams that are also still in the running for the conference. North Texas is 7-1, 3-1. They're the team that's behind South Florida, having lost to the Bulls, obviously. You've got Temple, who is alive in the conference race at 3-1. They're 5-3 overall. And then East Carolina, they still have a lot of conference games to play, and they play some of these teams ahead of them. And even though they're 4-3 overall, they're still in the picture. So the American Conference is going to be a lot of fun to watch over this last month of the college football season. I'm going to be trying to pay a little bit closer attention to it. I know I give a lot of attention to the Big Ten and the SEC and even Big 12 and ACC, but this is a fun race to watch. It'll be exciting to see how things finish up there. But But that is all for this episode of College Football Talk. I'm your host, Peter Burnett. Have a great rest of your day. Stay tuned for my next video. I'll be previewing the Week 10 action across the board. And let me know in the comments below what other type of content you want to see, because you guys seem to respond really well to that North Dakota State, South Dakota State game vlog. But thanks again for watching. I'm Peter, signing out. Peace.